On December 10th, 1938, Enrico Fermi accepted the Nobel Prize in Physics from the King of Sweden. He had packed everything he owned. He had quietly converted his savings to dollars. He held no return ticket back to Italy. The fascist state that had celebrated him as its greatest scientific mind had no idea what was happening. This was not a trip to Stockholm. This was the most elegant disappearing act in the history of science. And Rome wouldn't realize it until he was already gone. To understand what Fermi did, you have to understand what he was walking away from. Rome, 1938. Enrico Fermi is arguably the most important physicist in Europe. He holds the chair of theoretical physics at the University of Rome. He leads a group of young researchers that Italian newspapers have already dubbed the boys of Via Panisperna. A tight circle of brilliant minds working at a pace that few institutions in the world could match. Fermi has been decorated by the regime. He holds the title of Academician of Italy. Mussolini's government has used his name, his face, his work as proof that Italian science stands at the summit of the world. He is, by every visible measure, untouchable. But Fermi is also a husband, and his wife, Laura Capon Fermi, is Jewish. In July of 1938, the regime publishes the Manifesto of Race. By autumn, the racial laws follow. Overnight, Jewish citizens are stripped of professional positions, educational rights, civil protections. The state that had celebrated Fermi now threatens the person closest to him. The calculations Fermi is running are no longer about neutron cross-sections. They are about risk, about time, about his family's survival. He has 2 children. He has a wife who can no longer, under the new laws, be fully protected by the institutions that once sheltered them both. Fermi is not a man who panics. Colleagues describe him as almost unnervingly calm under pressure. Precise, methodical, someone who solves the problem in front of him without catastrophizing. What he does next reflects exactly that temperament. He doesn't flee, he doesn't make a scene, he waits. In October of 1938, the telegram arrives. The Nobel Committee has awarded Fermi the Nobel Prize in Physics. According to the citation, for his demonstrations of the existence of new radioactive elements produced by neutron irradiation, and for his related discovery of nuclear reactions brought about by slow neutrons. It is a genuine and deserved recognition. But Fermi sees something the Nobel Committee does not intend to offer. He sees a door. He requests permission from the Italian government to travel to Stockholm to accept the prize. The request includes his entire family, his wife, his children, their full luggage. The permission is granted. Why would it not be? The regime benefits from the optics. One of Italy's greatest scientists receiving the world's most prestigious scientific prize. It is propaganda that writes itself. What the regime does not know is that Fermi has already converted his financial assets into dollars. He has already been in contact with Columbia University in New York. He has already made arrangements that assume, with cold certainty, that none of them will be returning. December 10th, 1938. The Stockholm Concert Hall. Fermi stands before King Gustav V of Sweden. He bows. He accepts the medal, the diploma, the recognition of a lifetime of work. The cameras record it. The newspapers will print it. Laura Fermi later writes about that evening, that even in the middle of the applause, surrounded by the formal ceremony, she felt that they were already gone. That the clapping and the lights and the medals were happening to people who had already decided to leave. The dread, she writes, was beneath everything, not visible, but there. That is December 10th. By January 1939, the Fermi family is in New York. Enrico begins his position at Columbia University. He is now an immigrant, an exile, though Italy hasn't used that word yet. And then, within weeks of his arrival, the announcement comes from Berlin. Otto Hahn, Fritz Strassmann, Lisa Meitner, and Otto Frisch have identified nuclear fission, the splitting of the uranium atom. The physics community absorbs this with something between excitement and alarm. Fermi absorbs it with something else, because here is a detail that rarely gets enough weight in the telling. In 1934, while working in Rome, Fermi and his team bombarded uranium with slow neutrons. They observed unusual results. Results that, in retrospect, were almost certainly evidence of fission. The discovery of the century sat on his laboratory bench for 4 years, and he didn't recognize it, not because he lacked the skill, because the theoretical framework to understand what he was seeing didn't yet exist. Hahn and Meitner and Frisch built that framework. When fission is formally announced in January 1939, Fermi understands immediately what it means, not just as physics, but as engineering. If you split a uranium atom and it releases neutrons, and those neutrons split more atoms, and those atoms release more neutrons, you have a chain reaction, a self-sustaining, potentially runaway release of energy. Fermi begins working at Columbia on exactly this problem. Then, in 1942, he moves to Chicago. Under the west stands of Stagg Field, a university sports stadium, a squash court converted into the most consequential laboratory in human history, Fermi begins construction of what will be called Chicago Pile 1, or CP1. The design is, in principle, straightforward. In practice, it is enormous. According to historical accounts, the pile consists of roughly 19,000 pieces of uranium metal and uranium oxide, embedded in some 45,000 graphite blocks, totaling around 380 tons, arranged in layers. The graphite acting as a moderator, slowing the neutrons enough to sustain the chain reaction without letting it accelerate beyond control. Control rods made of cadmium are inserted into the pile. Cadmium absorbs neutrons. Pull the rod out. More neutrons reach more uranium. The reaction climbs. The pile is built by hand. Scientists, graduate students, physicists who weeks earlier were writing theoretical papers are now cutting graphite blocks on a squash court in Chicago. Fermi oversees it with a slide rule and a calmness that, by this point, his colleagues have come to recognize as his operating mode. He does not appear nervous. He appears to be solving the next problem. December 2nd, 1942. The team assembles under the stands of Stagg Field. Fermi gives the order to begin withdrawing the control rods incrementally. A physicist named George Whale pulls the final rod by hand, a measured distance, as Fermi instructs. The Geiger counters begin clicking, then clicking faster. The clicking becomes a continuous sound, a scream of recorded radiation that means the neutron population is growing, sustaining itself, not dying out. Fermi watches the instruments. He makes a calculation. He smiles. He says, according to accounts from those present, the reaction is self-sustaining. They let it run for 28 minutes. Then the rods go back in. The reaction stops. Chicago Pile 1 has just demonstrated the first controlled nuclear chain reaction in human history. The atomic age has a birthday, December 2nd, 1942. Shortly after, a coded phone call is placed to James Conant, the scientific administrator overseeing the project. The message, the Italian navigator has just landed in the New World. Conant asks, how are the natives? The reply, very friendly. The metaphor is not accidental. Fermi, the Italian navigator, had crossed an ocean to reach this moment. His escape from fascist Italy, enabled by a Nobel Prize used as a passport, had brought him to a squash court in Chicago, where he lit the first controlled nuclear fire in history. The two threads, the husband protecting his family, the physicist unlocking the atom, are the same thread. One did not happen without the other. The distinction that matters here, Fermi built the reactor. He demonstrated the chain reaction. The weaponization, the bomb, belongs to a different project, a different team, a different moral weight. Oppenheimer and Los Alamos sit downstream of what Fermi proved in Chicago. Fermi was the engineer of the fire. What others did with it is a separate reckoning. Fermi never fully reconciled his relationship to what followed. He continued his scientific work with characteristic precision and apparent calm. But colleagues noted that the question of consequences was not one he avoided. He died in Chicago in 1954, according to reports, of stomach cancer. Whether his illness was connected to his years of proximity to radioactive materials is something historians and physicians have discussed, without definitive conclusion. He was in his early 50s. Italy, meanwhile, never rebuilt what it lost. The Via Panisperna group scattered. The racial laws had gutted the universities. The physics culture that had produced Fermi, and that Fermi had sustained, did not recover in any meaningful way for a generation. Fermi's Nobel Prize was an exit visa, disguised as a laurel. The fascist state that used him as a symbol of national greatness also enacted the laws that made his departure inevitable. And with him went the neutron physics, the reactor design, the chain reaction, and the first chapter of the atomic age. The question worth sitting with is this: how many Nobel Prizes never happened? Because the physicist didn't get out in time. How many chain reactions were never demonstrated? How many discoveries were never made? Because the state turned on the mind that would have made them. Fermi's story is not primarily a story about a bomb, or a prize, or even a reactor. It is a story about what it looks like when a man calculates, with perfect cold precision, that the most important thing he can do is leave. If this kind of technically grounded history is something you want more of, the decisions behind the discoveries, the engineering beneath the events, this channel is built for exactly that. There's more here worth your time.